Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 151 and I am the show's host Kyle. On this episode, the show I'm going to be discussing Mattis's release of the National Defense Strategy, including his speech he gave when he announced it. So, I've done quite a few of these type of shows recently where I'm kind of reacting and breaking down, maybe inviting on a guest to some big speeches. I think we did it with the National Security Statement, with Tillerson's speech on Syria, and with Trump's State of the Union address. So, I hope these are all things that you enjoy. This one I'm going to be doing it solo, but anyways, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or the libertarianinstitute.org. If you would like to share the show, helps the show to grow, helps this message to get out there to more people. I don't know how many people actually take the time to listen to these speeches and read these statements. At least the National Defense Strategy was significantly shorter than the National Security Strategy. However, I don't think a lot of people are reading them, but I think there's a lot of very important information in here. I'm actually going to just start off with a clip where Mattis kind of sets up and discusses the importance of the National Defense Strategy.
To introduce our unclassified summary of the classified document. Parts of it are classified because we owe a degree of confidentiality to the troops who will carry out this strategy. It is, as was noted by the Dean, our nation's first national defense strategy in 10 years. I believe it's a moral obligation for leaders to lay out clearly to the subordinates in the Department of Defense what it is we expect of them. It is designed to protect America's vital national interests, and this defense strategy was framed, as was noted by the Dean, by President Trump's national security strategy.
So I think we get one or two really important facts there. The first is that this is based off of the National Security Strategy, and I think we get a little bit of Mattis's interpretation of it. I think one of the important things about this is that at least there's a perception that Trump is a little bit hands-off on foreign policy, and that there's the quote-unquote adults in the room that are constantly working to not undermine, but I guess kind of undo some of Trump's more bolsterous rhetoric where he's, out there tweeting about fire and fury and all this stuff. But I think as we move through the speech, we're going to see that Mattis is really on board with that. And the idea that, these adults in the room are going to make the right and wise decision really isn't true. Mattis also talks about the moral obligation that people have to the soldiers and that, they kind of have a right to know what the strategy is and how it's going to be laid out. And then he points to the fact that there hasn't been one in 10 years. And, to some extent, I guess I can't disagree with that. I guess if I was a soldier, maybe it would be helpful to have something like this laid out so you could have some relative idea of what you're going to be doing and what the goals of the organization you work for. I mean, if you're somebody who's been in for 6 years and you're looking at re-enlisting for another 4, 6, or 10, having that idea of, if the mission is changing and how so may alter, whether you want to stay in or not. And so I guess I could agree with that, but there's a lot of other moral obligations that you would have to any soldiers, like only putting them in positions where they're risking their lives if absolutely necessary. I kind of understand the idea that these are people who signed up to risk their lives, but they're not signing up to risk their lives doing something stupid. It's not like these are somebody, they're auditioning for like the military version of Fear Factor. And it's some kind of game show, where you get put in some random town in Afghanistan and see if you could fight your way out. That's just, not what they're signing up for. What they're signing up for is to protect the American people if the American people need that protection. And so, I think too, as we go through this, I could kind of point out a couple places where that's obviously not the case, where whatever is happening to these soldiers is not for their own benefit and it's not really helping them out. And it's not what they signed up to risk their lives for. It's not that these are something like young Frenchmen who were looking to repel the Nazi invasion during World War II. There's no situation where, they're actually repelling an attacking force from the United States. We also get the phrase, and we'll hear it a lot in this show, about American interest and vital interest and American values and all these other kind of key words and phrases that mean absolutely nothing, but it's the way Mattis justifies using our soldiers for things that, morally Mattis shouldn't be allowed to use those soldiers for. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next clip.
Of that national security strategy, specifically where it states that we're to protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. And it goes on to say, and to preserve peace through strength. Those are words out of the national security strategy, and we carry those themes inside the Pentagon where we say, what does that mean for us? Of course, national security is much more than just defense. This is our part of the responsibility.
So here again, we get a couple of key phrases that I really want to talk about. First, he says, the point of defense is to protect American people, protect the homeland, and protect the American way of life. And I don't know if, this is necessarily true, and I think the way he uses it, he's going to use it to justify doing a whole lot more than just protecting America. In World War I, there was a situation where a ship, I believe it's pronounced the Lusitania, was sunk, traveling maybe in the North Sea, but somewhere in between the UK and Germany, and while there were civilians on the ship was also carrying some arms. There were some Americans on the ship, and this sparked a lot of debate whether Americans had the right to be protected by their government abroad, and whether that, would warrant retaliation against the German government, etc. Now, ultimately, I think the American war machine was able to exploit the victims of the Lusitania to help get America to enter into World War I. But the point is that there's a real debate here whether the American military has any duty to protect American people who travel overseas, or if that's a situation where you do so at your own risk. If, for example, I want to go take a tour around the Syrian desert there, do I have the right to have an American drone escort me and blow up anybody who might come into contact with me and want to kill me? What I think ends up whenever you pursue this policy is, rather than having a situation where, American military is, just being protected overseas, where we could kind of justify protecting maybe some aid workers located out in dangerous areas and then blowing up innocent civilians to do so. And, nothing against people who are going out there and trying to help people or whatever, just, kind of as we saw, with the journalists captured by ISIS, at what extent does the American military go ahead and maybe risk the lives of innocent people in order to save them? The homeland is the one thing that the American military was actually built and established to protect. So, Mattis got at least that one little word right. And then we have the American way of life here. This is kind of the concerning one, because this is where we start to get into the nation building discussion in national defense, starting to mean that we're going to defend the borders of Iraq or Afghanistan, when it makes absolutely no sense how that has absolutely anything to do with American way of life. And so, as you'll see, American interest, American way of life kind of repeats itself throughout this speech. We also get another disturbing statement here. This is the peace through strength one, and the idea that Mattis has, and I think this is something that Mattis seems to actually believe, is that if America is the strongest and could dominate anyone in any battle ever, then there will be absolute peace in the world. But that's just not the case, right? Because people are going to exploit, like, the Saudi military, the way the Saudi Arabians or the Israelis do, or the French do, when it comes to North Africa. There's other countries and people that are going to exploit the ultimate strength of the American war machine in order to attack their enemies. Of course, this happens on a more localized level when you have different either Somali or Afghani tribesmen convincing the American military to take out the rival tribes and not the actual Taliban or actual enemies of the Americans. And so, yeah, the idea that you have peace through strength is absolutely ludicrous, and the idea that just because there's one bully that could beat up everybody else on the playground doesn't mean you're gonna have the ultimate stable society and the right global order. Alright, now I'm gonna skip ahead in the next clip.
Today, America's military reclaims an era of strategic purpose, and we're alert to the realities of a changing world and attentive to the need to protect our values and the countries that stand with us. America's military protects our way of life, and I want to point out it also protects a realm of ideas. It's not just about protecting geography. This is a defense strategy that will guide our efforts in all realms. The world, to quote George Shultz, is awash in change, defined by increasing global volatility and uncertainty, with great power competition between nations becoming a reality once again. So we will continue to prosecute the campaign against terrorists that we're engaged in today, but great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security.
All right, so here we probably have, I think, probably the most kind of damning and dangerous of the Mattis speech right in this clip. First, he starts off by talking about America's military is reclaiming an era of strategic purpose. And you have to wonder what has been going on for the past 16, to 25 years, depending on how you want to classify it then. Certainly, we've been fighting endless wars for the past 16 years, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, or Syria. Also having troops now deployed all over Africa and all over the rest of the Middle East. It's really bewildering what Mattis thinks has been going on if that military is now reclaiming an era of strategic purpose. However, again, what is most concerning is what he lays out at the end of what that purpose will be. And I think this was, to me, the most shocking thing about the national defense strategy, and that is countering great powers is now the primary focus and not combating terrorists. And so, I guess it would have been nice to have a little bit of clarification from Mattis whether it was either the defeat of the Islamic Caliphate or if it was the rise of China, Russia, India, and whoever else that now makes America worry about great powers and not about the terrorists. Now, I guess this is interesting because for the past 16 years, the American military machine has been constantly jawing about how important it was and how dangerous the terrorists were, and how we had, all these drone programs and all these spying programs and all this money and intelligence spent in all these different countries to fight these little proxy wars in order to defeat the terrorists. Obama fought 2 of them in Libya. But now, when realistically, there's just as many or more jihadists in the world now than there has ever been. And maybe right at the height of the caliphate, there were just a little bit more than there are now. But still tens of thousands of these guys went on 9/11. There was only 400. And so to try to figure out how they're possibly evaluating the situation now that terrorists aren't the biggest threat in the world is really head scratching to me. Not that I'm an interventionist or ever advocate for the American military machine to go out there and start killing people. However, if you look at American policy over the past 16 years, it has drove a lot of people to jihad and a lot of people to become enemies of the American people. And for now to suddenly be declared the time that these people aren't a threat to Americans after we've created so many of them doesn't make a lot of sense. I guess it makes a little bit of sense if Mattis thinks that China and Russia are now uniquely rising hostile powers to the United States, but what we see is this really isn't the case either. Russia has been very willing to tolerate the United States working against Russian and Syrian interests in Syria. And so there's a pretty clear, signal there that both of these countries could work together. China and the United States are, I know China is the United States' largest trading partner, and I believe that vice versa is true too. And so if we could trade billions of dollars worth of goods a week, if not a day, you would think we would be able to figure out how, to get along and not nuke each other and blow each other up. And so for Mattis to pretend like these countries are, uniquely evil threats to the United States simply isn't true. I think China has offered some of the most reasonable solutions to the United States for North Korea. The freeze for a freeze deal where China offered before the, recent North Korean ICBM test and their recent hydrogen bomb test, that North Korea would freeze their testing in exchange for the United States and South Korea freezing their war games on the North Korean border. Something that sounded like an awfully good deal. However, the United States said, no, we can't do that. And so, like I said, it just really makes you wonder how they possibly see these countries as enemies. Now, one of the ways he does explain this is to point out that George Shultz says the world is getting more and more complex. However, a lot of that complexity is due to United States interventionism, like breaking Ukraine up into a couple of pieces and possibly partitioning Syria into 2 pieces, creating South Sudan, creating a failed state in Libya, possibly breaking Yemen up into 2 pieces. And so where you look at where the United States interventionism has actually caused most of the global instability, it's very difficult to then say, so now we need to worry about Russia and China. I think we can move on to the next clip.
This strategy makes a clear-eyed appraisal of our security environment with a keen eye on America's place in the world. This required some tough choices, ladies and gentlemen, and we made them based upon a fundamental precept, namely that America can afford survival.
All right, I include this clip for 2 reasons. One is that Mattis positions himself as a man making a clear-eyed appraisal, where maybe the foolish Obama regime thought that they could get along with Cuba or Iran and made these deals, we know that these people are completely unreasonable and we can't deal with them. But if you look at how Mattis lays out his policy, and if you look at the United States policy for Syria, our policies are anything but clear-eyed. In fact, in Syria, we laid out a policy that pit the two U.S. allies fighting in Syria against each other, and so it makes absolutely no sense how he can make this claim. And then the second thing is that Mattis says that we can afford survival. And this is something that I think I'll get to in the coming clips. But it's just very interesting how Mattis somehow interprets there being an existential threat from a opposing government on the actual values and ways of life of the West. And it's just really weird. And I think it's really important to note when we come across that in the speech. Now move on to the next clip.
We face growing threats from revisionist powers as different as China and Russia are from each other. Nations that do seek to create a world consistent with their authoritarian models, pursuing veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions.
All right, so this is the first thing. I think the next 3 clips is where Mattis is going to lay out who the enemies and who the threats to America are. The first he lays out are the revisionist powers. And this is Russia and China. Now, revisionist powers is a phrase that has been used time and time again in the Trump administration to refer to Russia and China. And basically what they're saying are that these powers want to reshape the world global order. Now, this kind of isn't true, because a lot of times when they're pointing this out, they're just Russia and China voting against the United States and the UN. So it's not like they're trying to go out and do things outside of the UN. They're just not wanting to go along with the US way of the world within the UN. And so I think that's a little misleading. And he also, kind of ideas that, maybe some people have ideas of global order other than American hegemony. Now, I guess it's kind of contradictory here, because in one way, if other countries having a military that questions American hegemony is a threat to America, the American hegemony has to be a threat to all these other countries. And so you have to wonder if Mattis looks at the world as a place where it's perpetual instability and that there's always somebody looking to dominate and always somebody about to get conquered. However, that would kind of go against his idea that we need peace through strength, and the only thing that's going to keep peace is having ultimate strength. Just some of his issues with China and Russia, he talks about kind of they're changing their borders, and this is typically charged at Russia countering American intervention in both Georgia and Ukraine. 2014 in Ukraine, there was an American-backed coup where the government was going to make a real push to join NATO. Russia wasn't too happy about that, but neither were a lot of the Ukrainians, who were mostly ethnic and native Russians, because this was once all the USSR. So 90-something% of the people of the Crimean Peninsula went out and voted to join Russia, and so they became part of Russia. And then Russia has bet some separatist groups near the Russian-Ukraine border, and these are people fighting against the government in Kiev, which includes neo-Nazis. I mean, there's the Azov Brigade that are actual neo-Nazis. They march in the streets and they got their Nazi patches on, and these are one of the most efficient fighting forces for the government that the U.S. backs in Ukraine. And so it's not hard to see why some people in Ukraine, especially if they're ethnic Russians, would oppose this. Something I always like to note for audiences, especially American audiences who don't always know this, the Russians suffer terribly at the hands of the Nazis. And while in the U.S. we kind of just get the narrative that Hitler's biggest blunder was picking a fight with the USSR, and while this may have been true, I think it cost the lives of 25,000 Russians in the process. So not 25,000, 25 million. So there's an awful lot of people in Russia who have, grandfathers and uncles and everything else that were killed in the World War II by the Nazis. And then China gets a lot of blame for the stuff going on in the South China Sea, although a lot of that is countering just the United States aggression. I even saw an article on this in Fox News, which was absolutely astounding to me. But basically, the American 7th Fleet, it has controlled the waters of the Indo-Pacific since World War II. And I think China is trying to flex a little bit of, regional domination here and say, hey, we want to say, and we don't like it that your destroyers and all these other ships are, floating right around our borders. Remember, this is the, South China Sea, not the Gulf of Mexico. And then Trump has always been on this, even before he was running for president. I don't know exactly how early I heard Trump talking about this, but it was pretty early. The idea that China is a currency manipulator and that the reason Americans are poor is because the Chinese are keeping their economy artificially low. But this is a problem that Trump wanted to solve. He should be slashing the military budget. That way we could pay back the debt that Americans owed to the Chinese and they would have less influence over our economy. All right, we'll move on to the next clip. I believe this is the rogue regimes.
Rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran persist in taking outlaw actions that threaten regional and even global stability. Oppressing their own people and shredding their own people's dignity and human rights, they push their warped views outward.
Okay, now we get the rogue regimes. This is Iran and North Korea. Again, throughout the Trump administration, these two regimes always get lumped together. And this is very concerning because these two regimes really don't have anything to do with each other. And if there's any connection or solidarity at all, it's only because they're both constantly being threatened to be attacked by the Americans. However, Mattis, makes kind of 3 points against them, and one is that they're either destabilizing the globe or the region. And it's hard to see how either of these countries could be destabilizing the globe. I mean, Iran has flexed a little bit of, regional muscle within the Middle East, just simply taking on the Islamic Caliphate, I guess, is their big expansionist move, as well as supporting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. However, fighting the Islamic Caliphate and supporting Hezbollah can't be seen as something that's, globally destabilizing. And while North Korea has developed nuclear missiles, it really hasn't changed a whole lot on the global stage. It's not like other countries are suddenly rushing to militarize or anything like that. In fact, other countries that would maybe mimic this model, like the Iranian regime, have cut a deal with the United States in hopes to avoid them escalating to gain nuclear weapons. They always complain about these regimes suppressing their own people, and certainly I kind of understand that, especially with the North Korea situation. The people there are pretty oppressed. I also talked to Iranian who now lives in Australia but was in Iran near the time of the protesting. I think he was even there for part of the protesting. His name was Shaheen, and we are both on the Liberty Weekly podcast together. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. And by the way, he told me I wouldn't necessarily want to live in Iran either. However, there are plenty of spots in America where there's plenty of abuse. If you look at the way American prisons are run and, kind of the way the police treat people in the inner city, everybody should go check out a story. And I'll link to one of the stories in the show notes here, but just the way that this gang of Baltimore cops, I think there was 8 cops that were just going around absolutely terrorizing the citizens. Kidnappings, extortions, robberies. They carried toy guns on them in case they accidentally, killed someone and needed to plant a gun. It's absolutely atrocious and disgusting. And so, I get it that Mattis is sitting there saying, well, the Iranian regime doesn't treat the people well. They don't. But at the same time, America could turn the finger inward every once in a while too. Also talking about exporting the ideas. And again, if you kind of look at the way people look at both Iran and North Korea, nobody wants to live in Iran. Nobody wants to live in North Korea. Nobody wants to live in Venezuela. And so, I think by America not sanctioning them and not attacking them, it puts all the onus of the poor state of the people on the actual regimes itself and not in any way on the Americans. Rightfully so. When people look at the situation in North Korea and in Iran, they say, well, American sanctions are really hurting the economy, and American threats to attack the country are forcing the governments to put more money into defense and less money into, food and other welfare, infrastructure type projects. However, regimes like that don't do very well anyways, and left on their own, they would fail. However, if America continues to intervene, it sends a signal that, maybe it's not all the fault of those regimes. So if Mattis wanted to convey that message, he should, vote for repealing sanctions. We'll move on to the last clip for this section.
And despite the defeat of ISIS' physical caliphate, violent extremist organizations like ISIS or Lebanese Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda continue to sow hatred, destroying peace and murdering innocents across the globe.
All right, so I've covered quite a bit of my stance on Al-Qaeda and what kind of threat Al-Qaeda and the terrorists are to the United States already, so I don't need to get into a whole lot of that here. I do want to point out that sandwiched in between ISIS and Al-Qaeda is Lebanese Hezbollah, which has done nothing but fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria and Iraq since the rise of the Islamic Caliphate and the Syrian civil war. And so how you could lump an enemy in between two jihadist groups doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and is so dishonest and so disingenuous, and is part of the United States propaganda campaign against the Iranians, because we all know that Iran supports the dangerous, evil terrorist group Hezbollah. But, Hezbollah isn't a terrorist group anymore, at least. We'll move on to the next clip.
In this time of change, our military is still strong, yet our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare: air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, and it is continuing to erode. Rapid technological change, the negative impact on military readiness, is resulting from the longest continuous stretch of combat in our nation's history, and defense spending caps, because we have been operating also for 9 of the last 10 years under continuing resolutions that have created an overstretched and under-resourced military.
All right, so first thing he talks about here is America's military competitive edge is eroding. Now, this is one of the most interesting things to me, because America is going to spend about $1 trillion on its defense in 2018. And as I pointed out before on the show, China comes in second at, I think, like $250 billion or so about a quarter of that number. Now, Mr. American First, Donald Trump, Americans are the best ever. You would think he would hold some kind of policy of, we're not being embarrassed by the Chinese when we're outspending them 4 times over. We're outdeveloping them by far at that pace as well. You would think from a Donald Trump, he could say, I'll slash the American military budget in 2. And, by Americans be Americans, we're gonna, just do everything that much better than everyone else. We'll work harder, we're smarter, blah, blah, blah. However, the actual situation that Mattis and the rest of the Trump administration has always laid out about the military is that our power's eroding. And it's a head scratcher as to how this is possible whenever, we just released a new, I think the world's biggest aircraft carrier, the Reagan class. We have the new F-35 program. We're revamping the nuclear triad, the bombers, the submarines, the Minuteman missiles. They built a new class of destroyers and frigates, and they got all this other stuff and all these other upgrades in the military going on, and yet they're constantly complaining that the military power is eroding it. It makes absolutely no sense. And then towards the end of it, he points out that, at least part of this is because of the longest active military operation stretch in the history of America. We've been fighting in Afghanistan for 16 years, in Iraq for 14, and we've had troops in Syria for a couple of years, and everywhere else in the Middle East and in North Africa. And then he goes on to, but it's the spending caps by Congress that are really screwing everything up. And so it's like, come on, dude, like, you had it right, you're right there, you're saying the right thing, and then you're like, but the spending caps are the problem. And you're spending $1 trillion a year on defense, so obviously the spending caps aren't the problem. I was listening to a right-winger not that long ago, and he was talking about how I don't understand why when Trump needed another $50 billion for the military, they just didn't end the war in Afghanistan. This way you just repurpose that money. You don't have to go to Congress and ask for another $50 billion, because the left side of the Congress is going to say, sure, but then you got to spend another $50 billion on Medicaid. And so by not asking for the increase, you get to be more conservative and you're ending a war. However, that never happens. The military budget's just going to keep going up and up and up. I believe I heard that Mattis is going to ask for at least another 7% increase for the 2019 budget. And remember, a 7% increase on $1 trillion is $70 billion. All right, I think I can move on to the next clip now.
Our military's role is to keep the peace for 1 more year, 1 more month, 1 more week, 1 more day, to ensure our diplomats who are working to solve problems do so from a position of strength and giving allies confidence in us. This confidence is underpinned by the assurance that our military will win should diplomacy fail. When unveiling his national security strategy, President Trump said, "Weakness is the surest path to conflict, and unquestioned strength is the most certain means of defense."
So in this clip, we get Mattis saying a lot of the same kind of stuff that we've had earlier in this speech. Is just all jumbled up here right together, and I think it's really good. He's saying, if we're not the absolutely strongest people in the world, then somebody's going to pick a fight with us, and that's going to undermine global stability. So we got to be the strongest and the best in the world. And this allows us to operate and negotiate from a position of strength. And so Mattis is sitting here saying that the only way for Americans to get a good deal negotiating is to point a gun at the other person saying, if you don't like the deal, we're going to pull the trigger. This is absolutely insane. It's not the way you negotiate any kind of lasting resolution. Even if somebody agrees to that, it's just so they don't get shot in the side of the head and then they're going to go back and fight later. And also, I just wanted to talk about here, Gareth Porter pointing out the problems of coercive democracy. He did a great show on this on the Scott Horton show that I will link to in the show notes page. But the idea that somehow, the Americans could just have the most powerful military so we could always force people to take deals that they don't like, and that's going to create a situation of global stability and peace is simply untrue because all these deals are going to be unstable. Nobody's going to really agree to them. Like I said, they're, just temporary until the Americans leave. Move on to the next clip.
Simply, we must be the best if the values that grew out of the Enlightenment are to survive. It is incumbent upon us to field a more lethal force if our nation is to retain the ability to defend ourselves and what we stand for. The defense strategy's 3 primary lines of effort will restore our comparative military advantage. We are going to build a more lethal force. We will strengthen our traditional alliances and building new partnerships with other nations, and at the same time, we will reform our department's business practices for performance and affordability.
Okay, here we go. There's a couple things I want to touch on here. One, again, we get this existential threat where if the Americans don't have the most powerful military in the world, the ideas of the Enlightenment are going to go away. Now, this is just absolutely insane, and I don't necessarily know how to debunk it other than to say that if you're going to make this kind of claim, you got to provide some kind of proof for it. Even if the Asian or, the people of Asia, whether it be the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians, want to have more say in Asia than the United States, this in no way puts anybody in the West or anybody in America at risk of having to change their ideas or ideals or their values. Certainly one of the things I think have been most destructive to the American way of life and our ideas and values has been spending $5 trillion killing people on the opposite side of the planet. That seems to me to be distinctly against the ideas of the Enlightenment and corrosive to our society in general. He says that we need a more lethal force. After, of course, the ideas of the Enlightenment, that we should all try to get along and that, reason and scientific evidence, he says that, if we don't have a more lethal force, then the world's at risk, and that the other 2 things we need to do are increase allies and cut waste, fraud, and abuse at the Pentagon. Now, the waste, fraud, and abuse line could just throw away because every politician ever says it and it means absolutely nothing. The more lethal force is another head scratcher just because America has a nuclear arsenal available to blow up the world a few times over. And we, have flying armed robots, Reaper drones and Predator drones that could pretty much blow anybody up anywhere at any time, by somebody stationed out in the middle of the desert in Arizona. And so, again, it's really a head scratcher as to what he means by a more lethal force, as I talked about all the upgrades going on to the American military already. The problem isn't us needing to build a more lethal force or anything like that. It's just if you want to have a lethal force, you can't have a lethal force stationed in every country all the way around the globe. There's just not enough Americans to do it. It's going to be mismanaged. It's going to be huge waste of money. That's why the Pentagon is in such disarray. It's because you have $1 trillion flowing through one agency. Of course it's going to be in disarray. Right, that's good.
The paradox of war is that an enemy will attack any perceived weakness. So we in America cannot adopt a single preclusive form of warfare. Rather, we must be able to fight across the spectrum of conflict. This means that the size and the composition of our force matters. The nation must field sufficient capable forces to deter conflict. And if deterrence fails, we must win.
How about this for the most insane policy ever? We have to defeat everybody in every way, in every possible field of battle, no matter what, or else we're at danger. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Obviously, that's a policy that only an insane person would recommend. He's talking about cyber warfare and warfare in cyber, in space, right? And so, he's talking about America has to have the most dominant anti-cyber warfare, the most dominant space warfare. And it's not ever, we're going to try to find ways to get along with other countries to reduce the overall threat that they pose to us or anything like that. I think that quote in particular just shows how delusional his overall policy is. is that we're just going to be better than everybody on everything. And for that reason, nobody's ever going to attack us or ever do anything bad. And that was kind of the overall message of this speech in the national defense strategy from Mattis. I think that's about it of all the things I want to talk about in the actual defense strategy. He goes on to blame Congress, saying that it was the sequester and the continuing resolutions that are hurting the military's readiness and preparedness. However, as I point out, they're spending $1 trillion a year. If you can't make that work with that amount of money when your next competitor is spending a quarter of that, then, the problem may be at the top and not at Congress. Now, I could see how there, is a lot of problems because Congress keeps passing these continuing resolutions and that this can make things more difficult at the Pentagon, but it certainly can't be blamed for everything. Under Trump, the government is still hiring ex-Lockheed employees, ex-Boeing employees, and putting them in positions where they're buying the weapons. This is the reason why things at the Pentagon don't work well. Overall, another very scary speech from the Trump administration, very hawkish on China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And needlessly so, none of these countries pose an actual risk to Americans. I heard somebody in the administration recently mention a comment about how we want to make sure that Russia doesn't attack Eastern Europe with nuclear weapons. And it's like, where do they even dilute themselves to think that this is a possibility that Russia's gonna nuke and then invade Eastern Europe? Why would that ever happen? But this is the idea of Mattis' national security strategy, that if they could dream up an enemy doing something, they have to have some way to stop it. I think we're going to see a lot more spending on nukes and missile defense and on space and cyber warfare. Huge contracts are going to be going out here. I think one of the overall negative things about this is that the companies that are going to get these contracts, especially in the cyber arena, are going to be Google and Twitter and Facebook and all these other big tech companies that are now going to get in bed with the government. And then they're going to have to make decisions pro-government to continue to get government contracts, which are just the easiest way of making money. I mean, if you owned a business and you weren't concerned maybe about who you were contracting with, you're just trying to make the most amount of money possible. Certainly the people you want to get the contracts from are the American government. Again, the last thing I just want to go back to, and I think the most shocking statement of the whole thing, was that Mattis now evaluates great powers, Russia and China, to be a greater threat to the United States than terrorism. And this is at a time where the terrorists, the size of the jihadist networks, are more extensive, they're more global, they have hundreds of times more people in them than they did on 9/11. And so how he could possibly make this evaluation is nonsensical, but it's very disturbing because these are the countries, terrorist attacks are terrible and they kill innocent people and it's tragic, but nuclear warfare between these great powers would be something that is possibly genocidal to the human race. If millions, if not billions of people dead, it is really unmeasurable. And so to put the United States in, and also these policies have such momentum too. So if the United States and Russia start trading sanctions and have all these problems with each other, even if a new administration were to come in and take simply a less hawkish stance on Russia, all the momentum, all the bureaucrats, everybody in place at the Pentagon and at the State Department is already there with an anti-Russia perspective, and it's just so hard to change it. And so it's really, really dangerous what's going on right now. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I hope everybody liked it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, on Facebook at the Libertarian Union. Lots of great shows over there. Liberty Weekly, which I talked about here. Trey with the Subversion podcast just put out an awesome video that y'all should check out. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE, and I have a private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. Thanks, everyone.